My name is Charles R. Smith Jr., and I am a children's book author, poet, and photographer. I have over 40 books to my credit, one of which I did with Floyd Cooper. Now, when it comes to doing books, when there's a book that's written by one person and illustrated by another, people think that we often work hand in hand together and that we're great friends and that we've done lots of books and we'll keep doing lots of books together. But actually, it's not quite that way at all. Often the author writes what they write, they move on to what they're doing, and then the manuscript gets in the hands of the illustrator, and then the illustrator brings it to life. Now, I'm going to share with you the book that Floyd and I did together, and I will talk about some of the things some of the questions that Floyd brought up to me as we worked on the book. So let's just get to it. So the book is called Brick by Brick. It talks about how the White House was built, which was by slaves. It wasn't only slaves that built the White House, but that's what the story focuses on because it's such a unique part of American history. So the book opens. Under a hazy, hot summer sun, many hands work together as one. The president of a new country needs a new home, so many hands work together as one. So right now I'm establishing a pattern through repetition. Many hands work together as one. And that was probably the big thing that I really talked to Floyd about going into the book, because that was the first question he asked. He says, well, is there anything in particular that you were going for or a theme here? And I says, what I was really focusing on was the hands, because you'll hear the word hands repeated. Hands could actually be your hands, but also hand is another word for a helper, a laborer. And I wanted to express to Floyd the importance of showing, the strength that was in these hands for the task that they had to do. Black hands, white hands, free hands, slave hands. Slave hands dig, saw, and break stone, laying the foundation for the president's home. Rented as property, slave hands labor as diggers of stone, sawyers, and bricklayers. Diggers swing axes to break up stone, laying the foundation for the president's home. Jerry, Jess, Charles, Lynn, Dick, Bill, Harry, Jim. In my research, when I came across many slave names, I wanted to include them to provide names to these forgotten faces. Slave hands swing axes 12 hours a day, but slave owners take, slave hands pay. Slave hands sweat under a bright sun. Slave hands toil until each day is done. So this is one of my favorite spreads because we can clearly see the strength in those hands. We see all of the hard workers, and we see the overseer, that is the person in charge of the slaves, making sure they don't try to escape. Chiseling, carving, and transporting stone, slave hands ache, dark skin to white bone. Slave hands blister under a bright hazy sun. Slave hands toil until each day is done. Sawyers saw blades through logs of oak wood 7 days a week where a forest once stood. Alec, Ben, William, Moses, Simon, Peter, Frank, Thomas. Up, down, push, pull, 2 men per pit saw, spraying sawdust until slave hands are raw. Slave hands saw 12 hours a day, but slave owners take, slave hands pay. Slave hands bleed under a hot, hazy sun. Slave hands toil until each day is done. This was one of my favorite spreads that Floyd did because it shows perfectly how hard the slaves are working while the owners actually get the money. Often when we think of slaves, we think of grown adults, specifically grown men like myself who would be strong and able to do this work. But the fact is, if you were a slave, you were a slave, whether you were a child, a woman, or a strong man. And plenty of children did slave labor too. Clay, sand, and water is mixed by young slave hands to create bricks. Nameless, faceless daughters and sons build brick by brick until each day is done. So again, I'm repeating that phrase, brick by brick, because I want to talk about how the White House was built brick by brick and how those bricks were made by slave hands. Oyster shells mixed with rock, lime, and sand become mortar for bricks spread by slave hands. Will, Nace, Gerard, Manuel, Liverpool, Lester, Herbert, Samuel. Slave hands spread mortar 12 hours a day, but slave owners take, slave hands pay. Now, this was actually the only picture that Floyd called and asked me about. He said, would it be realistic to have the slave here have chains? And I said, actually, that would be unrealistic because since all of the work was done in one place and they were watched, there was really not the worry that the slaves would run away, which is why they would normally be kept in chains. But he did keep the irons on to remind us that what we are seeing is a slave hard at work. Slave hands crack under a hot, hazy sun. Slave hands toil until each day is done. Slave hands learn new trade skills using chisels, saws, hammers, and drills. Skilled hands earn 1 shilling per day, reaching slave hands closer to freedom with pay. So the hopeful part of the book comes in this moment when the slaves actually get to earn a skill to earn some money to pay for their freedom. Now, I remember speaking in a school and whenever I would say pay for their freedom, kids always look at me like, pay for freedom? And back then, that was the case. You basically needed papers to say that you were free. And if you didn't have those papers, you could be treated as a slave. And brick by brick, slave hands build. Day by day, slave hands gain skill. Month by month, slave hands toil, planting seeds of freedom in fertile soil. Freedom has a price in a land of liberty, so slave hands toil to no longer be property. Brick by brick, where a forest once stood, grows the president's house made of stone and oak wood. Slave hands build and slave hands save shillings to be free and no longer a slave. Slave hands count shillings with worn fingertips and purchase freedom earned brick by brick. I'm gonna miss you, Floyd. Awesome job on this book. I'm so proud to have it out in the world, and I'm so proud to have his name on it. Thank you all.